Hi, Ben.
Hi, Jolene. It
How's
just
everything?
took me a second to get the audio working.
How are you doing after such a busy week?
Good. I'm actually also moving this weekend, so been trying to do that in my free time as well. So it's been definitely a busy one.
Well, I'd say that, nobody fully understands or appreciates how much you're in this position more than me. I fought for 5 years to have your position, and believe me, ACE would not have been able to do a quarter of what we did in the past couple months if we didn't have somebody like you in the position. So, I just want you to know how much I appreciate you that you're here.
Yeah, well, I mean, I appreciate that, and I really hope that going forward, the the university is going to be able to open things a little so that they can make me a little bit more permanent rather than as temporary as it's been.
Yeah, I didn't quite understand because, uh, yeah, I didn't understand the technicality of that, and I haven't really been apprised at how they positioned you because I thought you were being hired in a permanent position. So that's yeah, I think I'm sure that Kurt will do what he has to do in order to make sure that it happens.
Yeah, it's just, it's obviously during this time, especially, it's been, a little worrisome. And temporary status never fully looks great when you're trying to do anything else. Like, so I actually just bought a house.
Yeah.
Um, but I had to do so using the help of my parents because I can't technically apply for a loan
Yeah.
because of the temporary status, which is a huge bummer. But at the same time, I'm lucky that I had that opportunity anyway. But
Where's your
still,
house?
it's actually right on the west side of outside of Ithaca. It's only about 8 minutes outside,
Oh,
kind of
okay.
toward Enfieldish.
Okay. Yeah,
Yep,
that's
and it's
fabulous. I drive through
like
there
if you
all the
think about
time.
where, oh yeah, well, I mean, my parents' house is up in this area too.
Oh,
I
okay. Yeah.
actually, it's my grandmother's house
Oh,
that I
nice.
bought. So,
Nice. On your
um,
mom's side or your
yeah,
dad's
on my
side?
mom's side.
Oh. Now, what you said your mom was also doing Zoom calls. What did she do?
She was also doing, what was that?
Earlier in the semester, you mentioned that your mom was also doing Zoom calls. So
Oh yes, yes, she works for the lab of ornithology at Cornell.
oh,
Um,
okay.
she's in she's in finance there, so um, yeah, so she's got meetings all the time as well. Um,
So you're both competing for bandwidth.
yeah, not for too long
Yeah,
anymore, but
yeah.
yeah, it makes it tricky with doing all the video work because the only time I can really ever upload anything is overnight.
At night, I know. I run into the same thing as well. I run into it just because the servers are so busy now everywhere
Mhm.
that it goes faster actually if you do it at night versus trying to do it in the day where it's just like everybody's overwhelmed, especially you can really tell like the pull when K through 12 starts.
Mm-hmm.
You really get that bump. Okay, so where is everybody? Did they sign on later? Is that it?
Um, yeah, I mean, I guess,
Okay. Well, um, it starts at 11:30, right?
yes.
So Heidi, I thought Heidi might sign on earlier. I haven't
Yeah,
seen it.
I always like to come in a little early just to make sure.
I haven't seen. Now Heidi will have the ability to share screen, right?
I'll give it to her the second I see her come in.
Okay. And so, okay.
Yeah, I'm thinking possibly people aren't in just because everything is so exact in the world of Zoom meetings. Whereas, if it was a classroom, you'd have people coming in for 10 minutes or so before everything happens and, leaving late and etc. But
Yeah.
everything is so precise.
Yeah.
Very bizarre.
We need to take care of permissions in order to post the videos. And
Mm-hmm.
so I've just been under some pressure myself, so I haven't really pushed that, but we'll take care of it between now and Kagan's lecture. And as you noted, I CC'd you on the email that he hasn't committed to a topic yet, or so I'm gonna try and get to him over the weekend, and then we've got that one coming up. Now, do you have all the materials you need for? You have all the materials you need for both Meredith and for um,
Julia, right?
Julia.
Yeah.
So you could get those posters going.
Yeah, I should. I'll double check after this, just make sure, because I'll probably try to aim to get that, because Julia's is the one coming next.
No, Kagan.
Oh, Kagan was coming next.
Yeah, Kagan, then Julia, then Meredith. And so that I'm a little nervous. I mean, I'll make it up for
Let me
Kagan.
double check to make sure. Yeah, let me make sure I have
Julia's
that
stuff. Okay.
correct on the actual schedule. Let's see. I think this is the one that's. Yeah, I actually originally had Kagan for November 13th.
Okay, and when did you have Julia?
For the 30th.
Okay.
And that was as of September, looks like 22nd is when I did the last edit.
Okay, and then we have Meredith on 12/15.
I have on 12/04.
04. Okay. All right. Okay, so we've got a little breathing room then on Kagan, but if we could get Julia's materials going.
Yep, I should have that.
Okay, great. Okay. And you're still not able to go into the office, correct?
No.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, AIIS is still not approved for campus reactivation.
Okay, great. We've got some guests and students coming in. Welcome, Professor Geisler. Okay. How are you this week, Caitlin? Good to see you. Professor Geisler, I thought that your comment the other night on the AIIS dispossession panel was right on the mark, and I'm sorry that nobody has taken this issue up.
Thanks for saying that. It's, you could call it a sleeper issue, but it's going to wake up. And I think we're hearing good first soundings from the Cornell administration, but there may be legal issues here that are of a whole different magnitude.
Right. Yes. No, I know. It's, that's my sense of it. It's that, just because of Cornell's benefit from the dispossession, we did make a presentation last week or this past Wednesday at the Faculty Senate, and I'm sure you have access to that. And so, we just have to stay on top of it because it impacts everything we do going forward as Indigenous peoples and scholars and people doing, allied scholars doing this work at Cornell. And, it's a big deal.
It certainly is. I don't think it's sunk in yet across the Cornell community, and I include emeriti and people that our other alumni, I don't think it's sunk in yet how important this really is. It'll take a while.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to get anybody's attention these days, and I think that Kurt's doing a great job, and also the whole group over, you know, at AIIS to really focus people's attention on this. You know, I mean, it's been a challenge, you know. So, where's Heidi? Is coming in. Where is she? We're looking for a guest. There she is. Hi, Heidi.
Hello, I apologize. I appear to be upside down. I'm just going to rectify this. I don't know why.
That was a new one for me too.
Yeah, that's never had that. So we'll just see if I can't flip it around. I don't know what's going on here.
I suspect young hands at the keyboard.
Might in fact be the case, but all right. You're just gonna place it. Aren't you today? That was a new one. All right, we'll see how this works. I've solved this by taking my camera off the tripod mount and I'm turning it upside down.
Oh, okay.
Because I don't know why. There. Let's see if this works. All right, see if this works.
Yes, yay.
Okay. Then I just need to be a little lower.
Oh, well, very nice to see you right side up.
That's at a jaunty angle, is all I can say. Here, let me.
Yes.
Give me one more second here. This is odd. I don't know why it's doing this.
This whole time period is going to be remembered through this. Like, you know, I'm sure that my art students will be making all kinds of art of this in the future, of what this moment represented with all of their professors, you know, faces chin first in the screen. Great. Well,
Still a bit on the wonky side here. It won't. Hang on.
okay, no problem. Got people just.
Okay.
I was just complimenting you, Kurt, to Professor Geisler and also Ula and Ben on how you've been able to raise the profile of the dispossession issue at a time when it's so difficult to garner anybody's attention.
Tripod's not working.
So, you know, it's.
The issue is rather compelling. It publicizes itself, I think. So.
I'm not so sure. I mean, that's what Professor Geisler that's what Professor Geisler just commented on. You know, if you want to jump in here, Chuck. But I thought so far doing a great job.
Well, thank you.
I don't know if you wanted to just remind folks that are signing on right now about our blog and some of the progress we've made.
Yeah, so we have formed a faculty committee to study Cornell's relationship to Indigenous dispossession, both within New York State and more broadly as a consequence of the procedures used in the Morrill Act, which means we have ties to 15 states where and about 1 million acres of land beyond the boundaries of New York State. So the faculty have been working on this, doing research and writing, and we also have contributions from alumni. Professor Geisler organized a large group of people from the development sociology department. We have student contributions, the Native American and Indigenous Studies at Cornell, NASAC. We has a set of demands to the university which appear on the blog as well. And there's a lot of, so there's both text entries and videos of public presentations, and we just keep having stuff coming in. So we're gonna try and understand this more precisely in terms of the history, and we're gonna be making outreach to communities that have been affected by Cornell's actions to see what they're interested in as forms of redress.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. Well, I'd like to welcome, thank you, Kurt. That was just Kurt Jordan for those of you who are new to the American Indian and Indigenous Studies Speaker Series. Kurt is serving as the director of the program. And we do have a really important issue that we're addressing, which of course is the spurred by the land, known as the land grab issue, but it's about the dispossession of Indigenous people's land as benefiting the endowment of Cornell University. And so please do look at the website, and our colleague John Parmiter has written an amazing article on this. And today we're very excited to welcome Professor Heidi Bohaker, who is at the University of Toronto in the history department. I became familiar with Heidi's work through an organization that we both signed on to and were instrumental. And Heidi has certainly done a lot of the heavy lifting, which is GRACEAC, or the Great Lakes Research Alliance. And so Heidi's expertise is in her historic work on the Anishinaabe and material culture have been very important in the construction of this website, as well as the research that we're trying to promote, which is research which is thinking not in terms of national boundaries, but thinking around the entire Great Lakes, because that's the way Indigenous peoples were located in this region in the Northeast historically. And so, you know, part of her work is always rethinking those boundaries so that we're understanding and reading history more accurately. But another inspiration for me in Heidi's work has been her attentiveness to women and governance. And the issue is that women have historically been silenced in the archive because of the way that history was collected by Indigenous, non-Indigenous, predominantly non-Indigenous peoples since contact. And so the way that she's been able to instrumentalize the women's voices, and in particular in her work in governance, is by working with material culture in the archive. And so I've been very inspired by both her methodologies and her process, and have learned a great deal from it. So welcome, Professor Bohaker. I just want to share a bit of your formal bio, which includes your research interests in Anishinaabe political history in the Great Lakes region, Native American writing, communication systems, and material culture as sources for history, treaty relationships, federal government policies toward Indigenous peoples in Canada, and digital history. She has a broad interest in the types of archives and categories of information both states and non-state societies keep about their people. She's an innovator actually in the area of digital humanities, and has these amazing technical skills to deploy new technologies in collaboration with Great Lakes First Nations to connect communities with aspects of their cultural heritage, which is stored in museums and archives around the world, through GRACEAC, which is this organization that I've mentioned, which we'll share a link for that with you, Ben, if you could pull that up and link it, the Great Lakes Research Alliance for the Study of Aboriginal Arts and Cultures. This is the exciting part, and we're definitely going to have Professor Bohaker back and do something in person, because this is, I think, a really important thing. Her forthcoming book, Totem and Council Fire, Anishinaabe Governance Through Alliance, is due out this November through the Osgood Society for Canadian Legal History and the University of Toronto Press. And the Osgood Society, which, you know, if you know Canadian space, is a big deal, has selected the book as its members' choice for 2020. So congratulations, Heidi. That's amazing. And I'll just share with you a little blurb from that, from the press. Combining socio-legal and ethno-historical studies, this book presents the history of Totem, or clan identification markings, left by Anishinaabe on treaties and other legal documents from the 17th through the 19th centuries. The Totems reflected fundamental principles behind Anishinaabe governance that were often ignored by Europeans, who referred to Indigenous polities in terms of tribe, nation, band, or village, classifications that failed to encompass longstanding cultural traditions of political authority within Anishinaabe society. Very important. And so with that, we'll give Professor Bohaker a welcome to our speaker series, and thank her for sharing time with us today. So Heidi.
Well, thank you all. It's really a delight to be here with you. I was just chuckling when Jolene was talking about my mad tech skills as my, camera decided to flip itself. The dog ate my Ethernet cable, so I don't know how good my connection's going to be today. And I forgot to charge my headset, and this keeps falling out. So I don't know what's going on here, but but I've got a 10-year-old downstairs who's really ahead of me in the mad tech department. So. I know I'm not in person at Cornell, but I still want to acknowledge the land that Cornell is on and the Cayuga homelands, and how much I've been there once, and it was beautiful, and I wish I was there with you again but just to acknowledge those lands and the long Haudenosaunee history in that place and in that territory. And to say that I'm sitting right now on Treaty 13A lands with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation in my attic. And just to acknowledge them and how grateful I am to be here. These are also the same lands that the University of Toronto is on. And these lands have also been Haudenosaunee homelands, and they have been jointly managed under the Dish with One Spoon and other treaties, and they have a very, very long Indigenous history. And there are many other Indigenous nations who call Toronto home. So I'd like to acknowledge all of that just before I begin. I'm a settler scholar. I came into this work, I think out of a little accidentally, and maybe not so accidentally, but certainly out of a deep curiosity about why Canadian history was so boring. As an undergraduate and as a high school student, I thought that Canadian history was the most boring subject on the planet. I didn't realize that was actually cover for some of the really awful things that had happened through the settler colonial project that really hadn't been uncovered. And I was curious about why I grew up in a place, and I grew up in Oshawa, Ontario. It's an Anishinaabe name. In the province of Ontario, which is a word, it means beautiful lake. It's in Gayogohó languages. In Canada, these are all Indigenous names, and yet there was no Indigenous history. And I came into this rather accidentally, because when I went as an undergrad to university, I discovered that you had to take Canadian history, the full year class, as a major, to become a major in history. And so I changed anthropology. I actually changed disciplines to avoid taking an undergraduate Canadian history course. And that's where I encountered in anthropology information about Canada's treatment of Indigenous peoples, and all sets of questions. We had a wonderful Mohawk teacher at the University of Western Ontario, and just this whole world opened up that I had not seen before, and that really piqued my curiosity. And so this is sort of to situate where I came and how I came into this work. And you never know how you're going to be drawn into work and what questions are going to be raised in your mind that are going to direct your life in really amazing and incredible ways. So what I'd like to do is begin to share my screen. Now, I'm like laughing now. Jolene's now set the bar with my tech skills here, and I'm just going to blow something up as I attempt to do this with Zoom. So one participant can share. I should be able to share my show now. Let's see if this works. Yes, I will share the screen. Or no, maybe I'll just share this plot. There, go. That maybe it's better if you share an application. Does that work? All right, this is exciting. Okay. I really want to thank Jolene for that wonderful and warm introduction, and to say that the work I'm presenting here today is both work that I've developed in the book, Dotem and Council Fire, so I'll talk a bit about that. But it's also work that I want to turn into an article and then eventually something larger, because the underwriting or the invisibility of Indigenous women in the historical record, which is really, only in the last couple of decades, really starting to come to life. And even then, there's still so much work that needs to be done. And then it's actually, the more I work in this, the more I realize how critical this is for us to understand treaties. And there has been, the settler scholar historiography is certainly focused on Haudenosaunee women and their political roles in governance up to a certain point. There's been some acknowledgement, at least, of that. But Anishinaabe women are in the background. If you think of any of the major Great Lakes histories that have been written by settler scholars in recent years, or even in Michael Wicken's excellent Infinity of Nations, the center actors in all imperial encounters, in treaty making, in all of these relationships with newcomers are men. And women, when they show up, show up typically in the context of the fur trade as wives of these men, and we've had work by scholars, including my own supervisor like Sylvia Van Kirk and others like Jennifer Brown, who have shown how instrumental those women were in forming relationships in the fur trade. But again, when we come into trying to understand the foundational treaty relationships that were set up between Indigenous civilizations and newcomers, the importance of women's work in this has been completely, it's just not in the record. And so it's not something we're talking about, and the role in governance as well. And of course, the last century and a half of fairly oppressive assimilative regimes in both Canada and the United States have also sort of, especially you could think of in Canada as well, with the laws, the Indian Act, for example, which imposed elected band councils and denied Indigenous women the franchise, really pushed and marginalized women out of politics. So it's almost as if their invisibility was further increased. So I want to flip that around, and I want to flip that around because of this particular document that I've got on the front page here. And I want to also acknowledge Catlin's painting of Giska, the woman with her child in a cradle. It's a particularly dignified portrait of an adult Anishinaabe woman sitting for a portrait. There are, again, in portraiture, women are underrepresented, and they're typically shown in these sort of maternal roles. But I wanted her there visually as we think about this treaty document. Now, for the book Dotem and Council Fire, I worked on identifying what these Dotem images on treaty documents meant for Anishinaabe people and what they said about governance. But up until this document, the 1784 session from the Mississauga Anishinaabe, I hadn't seen any images that I could conclusively say belong to Anishinaabe women. And this one does. It actually says, her mark, her mark, her mark. There are 3 principal women, which is an Anishinaabe political role, who signed, and here's the Haudenosaunee connection. This is the cession of lands from the Mississauga to the Crown in 1784, the 23rd of May, 1784, that then Governor General Frederick Haldeman deeded to the Six Nations for the Grand River Haldeman Tract, which became the home of the Six Nations. So here are these women, and although this is the only document that I've found to date with these Dotem images of women on it. There are 3 other Anishinaabe treaties signed before 1811, which in their preamble make reference to the principal women. And why this is important, first of all, this is not just referring to like some specific women who have some standing in their society, but as Carrie Miller has shown in her work, Ogama, on Anishinaabe leadership, women's councils were actually a constituted body within Anishinaabe governance. So those nods in the preamble to the treaties being made with the chiefs, the warriors, and the principal women are actually referring to elements, core groups or constituencies of decision-making bodies within a common council, or a council fire, or Anishinaabe council fire. So I'm going to talk about that with you today. I'm really excited to share some of this work with you. Now, a show of hands for how many of you would like me to have a little bit more of an explanation. Actually, I'm just going to do that anyway. It's probably be like, yeah, I need to know a little bit more about this Dotem tradition, which I'm happy to do. So the Dotem tradition is, see if this works. Yes, there it goes. The Dotem tradition, the Dotem, I should say, is an Anishinaabe kinship category. So it's unique to the Anishinaabe in the way that Otara is unique to the Haudenosaunee. And it is, I discussed it at great length, obviously, in the book. It's a kinship identity that is found and discussed in origin stories, and it's mentioned and discussed in early 17th century texts with Europeans who first, when they first encounter these Anishinaabe families. It also linguistically, linguists tell me that the root word, well, the Dotem itself, its root is ode, which means both heart and fire. And these are, the word itself and its associated roots are very old. So we've got these origin stories that situate the origin in deep time as this foundational kinship category. And linguistic and other evidence that just points to the tremendous antiquity of this system. And Dotem identity was typically passed down from fathers to sons. And when couples married, and women, not just fathers to sons, they passed down from fathers to children. But when families married, each partner kept their own Dotem identity. So every couple was in fact, if you could think about it, like an alliance between 2 different kinship lines. And that's where the sort of governance through alliance idea begins with. In fact, in Leanne Simpson's book, Dancing on Her Turtle's Back, she talks about the foundational elements of treaty relationships beginning in childhood, that the mothers are the principal teachers of these ideas around treaty relationships, that breastfeeding itself is a sort of a foundational teaching in a treaty relationship. And you can really think from the elders' teachings, Edna Manitowabe is the principal elder she was working with, about the ways in which a mother then is giving birth to a child who's going to have a different Dotem from herself. Right? It's going to have the same Dotem as typically as the father. And so immediately in this world of kinship, where you are kin not just to that you have this kinship relationship and a deep and immediate family kinship relationship and kinship connection with all your fellow Dotem beings, no matter whether they live in your community or whether they live in another council fire somewhere else in the Great Lakes. So, and then any relationship between Dotem, so you have this automatic kind of relationship with your Dotem kin, but bringing together people from different Dotemag in the plural requires work. It required work. It required the reciprocal exchange of gifts, reciprocal exchange of care. And so, as I argue in the book, philosophically then, what you have, and ethically, what you have is a system that from the smallest, you want to use the word household or sort of family, through to extended families, council fires, and links between council fires across the entire region, a system of reciprocal relationships developed through this model, a model of interdependence, where these totem beings from different totemeg are in fact dependent on, interdependent, I should say, on one another, and that there's a tremendous amount of gift exchange that actually happens in Anishinaabe communities historically that was about maintaining these relationships. And in fact, it's still very much a practice. If you spend time in Anishinaabe country, there's an awful lot of gift exchange that goes on, and formal councils and these sorts of gatherings. So, so I've shown you on the left, now just the realization, I should say, in studying all these totem images on the treaty documents is that the treaties documents themselves, and these are actually interestingly quite different from the treaties in the US context. I might just speak about that for a second. Prior to the 7 Years' War, in the middle of the 18th century, most Anishinaabe peoples were allied with the French. After the 7 Years' War, or actually I should say, well, almost during it, the French were defeated by the British forces, and the British started to move into Great Lakes country, but they hadn't established any treaty relationships, and they weren't interested in engaging in present exchange. There was a widespread series of attacks on British forts in the summer of 1763, pushing back against this incursion onto territory without, engaging in the work to make a treaty. So what ends up happening is the British organize through William Johnson at Fort Niagara a massive long treaty conference in July of 1764. It's called the Treaty of Niagara, and somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 delegates from Great Lakes nations came, and at that council, nations who had been formally allied with the French were brought into the covenant chain relationship with the British that the British had already established with the Confederacy. And they, at that point then, sorry, I'm just gonna have a drink. Entered into an alliance relationship with the British. Now, at the same time that was happening, the British executive branch, or through the official proclamation of the king, I should say, the proclamation of 1763, laid out the rules by which Britain would have to acquire title to lands from Indigenous peoples. Okay, and this is a much bigger deal now in Canada than it is in the United States because of the American Revolution. So just to give you that context for why there are so many of these treaties in Canada. So after that, when British colonial authorities wished to purchase land, so first of all, it could only be purchased from the Crown, and it only be done in public council, and there were a bunch of rules around how those land transfers could take place. So that's to say, is if you look at treaties that were signed between Anishinaabe nations after the American Revolution with the United States, they look really different from these documents that were signed between members of the Anishinaabe nations and the British Crown after 1763. And Anishinaabe people did sign US treaties, including the Treaty of Greenville, the Treaty of Detroit, Fort Harmar, with totem images. They stopped signing with totem images after 1817 in the US. But the British continue to, this has become part of British practice, British Indian Department practice. And so there are totem images on treaty documents up to 1862. But totem is such an important political category, and it is so integral, I argue, to Anishinaabe governance. It's not surprising we also see it on petitions, and both Anishinaabe people on both sides of this new international border use totem images on documents that are produced in council when they're writing petitions to leaders. They do this in the United States as well as in Canada. And like the most recent example I have is actually from during the First World War in Canada. It's a petition to the then Prime Minister about hunting rights. So it has a remarkable continuity. So just to give you that concept, and in the paper today, I wanted to talk about that the work of bringing women then into this treaty research. And I should say that these, you know, from a perspective of different worldviews, the documents on the Canadian side, I just want to say, are actually, if you read the wording, identical to the kinds of contracts, I should say nearly identical, to the kinds of contracts that two British farmers would use, or British settler colonial farmers would use to sell land to each other. That is their title deeds, okay? Which is quite different again from the wording on the US side. But a couple of things there. The proliferation of these agreements, which actually result in the use of these documents to dispossess Anishinaabe peoples of most of their land in what is now Canada, actually are not themselves the treaty. So as I argue in the book, the treaty is actually the Treaty of Niagara, where the initial relationship is maintained, and that these documents that are asking for pieces of land, like the one on the left here, from 1798, which was purchasing St. Joseph's Island to allow the British to build a fort, that these are the kinds of accommodations that allies would make into meeting the needs of the other in Anishinaabe society on a regular basis when they met to renew their alliance relationships. Okay, so we really have to think about these coming out of an Anishinaabe legal tradition. And the fact that the British routinely gathered and gave presents and participated in the present exchange and all the words and ceremonies around these council minutes were performed through the Anishinaabe legal tradition and law of treaties really suggests that the British colonial officials at the time also understood this, and that these treaty documents have to be understood in that way. So what I found, though, when I studied them, these many different documents, is that the pattern of the Dotem signatories actually revealed the composition of the local council that was granting the lands. And there are two principal types of Anishinaabe councils. There was what Mississauga Anishinaabe missionary Peter Jones referred to as the common or local council, and then there would be general or regional councils. And these were all part of historic Anishinaabe ways of living in relationship with other communities. So you see here on the document on the left, this session, there are actually 4 cranes, a martin, a pike, and a thunderbird. Okay, so these are all Dotem images of men. The top image is Ogima, the person whose Dotem was, the person who was responsible in Anishinaabe tradition for keeping the council fire. And what I found was that that top Dotem position stayed the same Dotem at the different council fires. In other words, it wouldn't suddenly, a subsequent treaty in 1850 wasn't suddenly signed by somebody of a different Dotem. Okay, that the Crane, for example, retained their responsibility at Bawatang historically for keeping that council fire. Different people would take on that role, but it was always the Crane. But the composition of other members of the council would shift. And this is another, it's another treaty on the right. You can just sort of get a sense and a scale of the full one. On the right-hand side, I actually have, these are all eagles. This is from the Credit River, a caribou, and another pike from 1806. Okay, so what's really then important is that, to remember again, Anishinaabe families always married, took their partner from another Dotem. Again, there was the same principle of Dotem exogamy. It was a really, the level of an incest taboo. So but not only in the genealogical work that I did, not only were Anishinaabe women marrying another Dotem, they were often marrying someone from another council fire. So they were bringing in and making a lot, and through that work of moving to where their husband's family typically was located, they were doing sort of really critical work maintaining connections between those council fires that were already in alliance. But it's really important that this not be read through some sort of, marriage model like within a European context where women's bodies and women's reproductive labor are sort of used in this way, but the women themselves are not instrumental in sort of shaping the policy. Because I think actually Anishinaabe women were working really hard in these external relationships to maintain these connections between council fires. And so we have to, take off that, at least I do, have to take off that sort of settler colonial hat. And when I'm reading through these sources to understand the work Anishinaabe women were doing in maintaining these connections. So a couple of key points, and so that I discuss in the book as well, that some of the conversations I've had with elders have referred to stories of the role of grandmothers, in some cases the role of mothers, being the ones who initiate the marriage relationships to maintain ties between these fires. And this also kind of connects with when you start to think about, if you think about Anishinaabe women in this role as external relations, it's not really external relations because it's all part of, like, once you're in an alliance relationship, it's part of your world, but nevertheless maintaining these relationships over distance. If you think also about the scholarship and work that recognizes that Anishinaabe women's historic responsibilities were for the waters of the Great Lakes and the shorelines. So we have these connections as well. They also always paddle in the stern of the canoe, which is a thing I quite, I'm a stern canoeist myself. You just don't put me in the bow, I need to be steering. So there's a lot of connections there. Okay, so now, as I said, when we looked at the treaty documents, and again, there's the 1798 Council on the right, you can see that we've got 4 cranes. Each would be the sort of the head of extended family that would winter together, and a martin and a pike, and a thunderbird. So you have in Anishinaabe cosmology the representations of the sky world, the land, and the water world in council. But it's not the complete sort of Anishinaabe world of areas of responsibility. And if you look, for example, at Basil Johnston, he's a leading, sadly passed away, but leading Anishinaabe intellectual, and whose work, Ojibwe history, I think is required reading. He talks about the ways in which councils, Anishinaabe communities draw on all the knowledge of all the other lived beings in the Anishinaabe world. And so, and that expertise, can be grouped into these categories under leadership and defense and sustenance and learning and medicine. And so we see a much greater number of Dotem images here. And in fact, I should say, I found over 100, and some of them are quite local, like Lake of the Woods region in northwestern Ontario has Pelican Clan. Doesn't appear anywhere else, but there are pelicans in Lake of the Woods. So, there's some very regional locations. When I first encountered this and I was looking at these historic documents, my sense was that, oh, so maybe this new role has something to do with more recent adaptations during the reservation era, that which really affected Anishinaabe communities. People were confined effectively to reserves, and maybe this was a way of repurposing Dotem to serve more local and immediate needs. But the more work I did moving back and forth between the treaty documents in the 18th to the early 19th century and the records of the French in the 17th century, Johnston's chart here started to make sense in a whole new way. So when you think about the council that's representative of the Common Council, that's making decisions on land, that's signing these totem images here, it's really important to remember that each of these men who are a signatory would have had a spouse, and that spouse would have come from a different totem. And in fact, again, with the genealogical research I was able to do on the Mississaugas of the Credit, because the Anishinaabe missionary Peter Jones thought it was really important, and I love him for this, to write everybody's Anishinaabe name, their new Christian name, and their totem, wives and women and men, and children, in a sort of keystone document that just lets you see these relationships. And so not only would these men have had spouses with a different totem, but those women would almost always be from other council fires. So now your council would comprise your entire community council. All this community governance is in fact bringing in all the knowledge that Johnston talks about here, would have representation through these different areas, having people with responsibilities over these different areas. And so these core ideas that are expressed in Anishinaabe philosophy and epistemology are actually reflected on these treaty documents. And you can start to see then and imagine, even though the women aren't there, they are there. And you start to realize that this picture looks much more complicated than we've given it, than historians have recognized in the past. Okay, so yeah, okay, that's what I want to say there. Good. Okay. So really connected with all of this as well is this important work of gift giving. So in the work I've been doing on Anishinaabe treaties, especially treaties with the British Crown, there's always so much focus on the costs of presents by the British Imperial government, complaining about all the gifts they have to give to Anishinaabe communities every year at these present ceremonies. What seldom gets recorded, although it does, is that Anishinaabe peoples gave equal amounts back. And in fact, what was given as presents, which the British read as kind of tribute, or in some cases was actually in goods, the annuity payments for the land cessions, was from an Anishinaabe perspective, a formal ceremony renewing treaty alliance relationships through the exchange of gifts. And women enter into this in a couple of key ways. In many of the gifts that are now in British and French and other museum collections that were made by Anishinaabe people. Not all, but an interesting number, especially those that came into or were given to British colonial officials, were, I argue, gifts given in these Treaty Council contexts. That is, they were part of the renewal and exchange ceremonies that were required to cement these relationships. And so, and this isn't just from the treaty councils, this is going back into the older French archival record, into the Jesuit relations. There is actually a wonderful description of a council that happens, a regional gathering that happens in 1642. And it's the first one the Jesuits get invited to, so they write up a lot about it. And it was in late August, early September. It was in the time of the rising moon. It was held in north, on the halfway up sort of the Georgian Bay coastline, and all the ancestral council fires of the current Robertson-Huron Treaty from where Chippewas of Rama is today around Barrie, all the way up to Bawating and on Manitoulin Island, all came together for a council. And everybody brought lots of gifts. In fact, the Jesuits could not get over they said it was worth 50,000 leaves of wealth that was exchanged, gifts, over this 2-week gathering. And there were games and ceremonies, but there was also the return of the bones of those who had died out of their country to be sent home with to their birth families. And Father Lalemont, who was recording that council, noted that the women, he said, evinced a deeper feeling of mourning at seeing these remains. But of course, if your sister or auntie had married out into another community, this annual gathering might be the first time that you really are actually grieving that loss because the remains were coming home. But as an example of the work and worth of women in these contexts, the families, when they were returning the bones, they were also returning them with a huge number of gifts, wrapped, as the Jesuits said, in all that is valuable in the country, with porcelain beads, with beautiful boxes, with quill work, as an expression of gratitude for having had the life of the woman. And this is some of the many examples. This is a close-up example of some beautiful quill work from the Hunterian Museum at the University of Glasgow. And on the left is a portrait of an Amaqua man who is actually wearing a quill-worked robe. This is from like the late 17th century. So just to give you a sense that these techniques, although he's not actually wearing moccasins in this picture, I notice he's got bare feet, but his quill work is on his robe and on the headband he's wearing. Okay. Now, just to give you more sort of an imaginative sense of the kinds, first of all, the kinds of gifts, these were gifts principally that women were making, but also that these gifts were being exchanged with colonial officials as part of the treaty promise, the treaty compact, if you were. So this is John Caldwell on the left. He served in British North America during the 7 Years' War, and he's wearing clothing that was gifted to him in recognition of his status as a commander of a military post, and therefore in Anishinaabeg eyes as an Okima, right? So he was gifted this regalia, which he's now wearing in his portrait. So I just want you to imagine what people were wearing. And on the right is a set of clothing, middle I should say, is a set of clothing given to Andrew Foster, who was commanding at Michilimackinac. You can actually see the Thunderbird totem on his neck piece there. He may very well, in fact, have been adopted in and recognized as a member of that totem. Anishinaabe communities did not view adoption as a marked category. They adopted people, and that was a method through which one could acquire a totem. And it was a way also of addressing the fact that if children were born to non-Anishinaabe fathers, they wouldn't have a totem. So they needed to be, that was done and resolved through adoption. Okay, and the image on the right is a bulrush mat. And I actually have it this size because it's 2 meters long. It's a big mat. It's the kind of mat that Anishinaabe leaders sat on during council. This one's from Leech Lake. And some really exciting research by Miknak Migwans, who's a new professor of art history at the University of Toronto. And I encourage you all to get her thesis when it comes out, is investigating the connections between the Anishinaabe language terms around weaving, what's woven into these mats, which are basswood and bulrush or cattail, and the connection between that and Anishinaabe governance. When people sat in council, they sat on these mats. And the word mat was actually a metaphor for governance in the same way we use in Canada, for example, crown as a shorthand for the government. You know, we'll talk about the crown attorneys in a legal case. We don't actually mean they're wearing hats. It's just a reference to the constitutional monarchy. Anishinaabe leaders use mat in the exact same way as a metaphor. And so I put these 4 items together to give you that sense. Now I'm going to sort of bring this back around full circle to our work on Anishinaabe women in governance, because those, when Anishinaabe women gave gifts, and this is something that you can see in both the work of folks like Carrie Miller on her work on treaty gifts, and Miknak Migwan's work. Those gifts aren't just, here's a mat. Those gifts are from specific places on the land. So they are specific, these bulrushes are from areas that the women in those communities had responsibility over, or they had jurisdiction over those shoreline areas. And so something as simple as you want to look at this and reduce this. If you want to reduce this to an item that you sit on, you really can't, because there's so much more meaning in this particular item. And they were read in that way as well. And likewise with these other gifts, Alan Corbière, and I think Benjamin, I did send a bibliography around, so if anyone wants some of these books that I've been referring to, there's a bibliography Ben could post in the chat with some of these references. The headdresses as well are historically of huge significance, because they are a mark of leadership, and they were bestowed in council, and they were bestowed at regional councils. So a local council fire would come to a regional council with a chief and a gima that they wanted to ratify. And at that ceremony, the candidates, I guess, would be given their, what the Jesuits referred to as their commissions, which were their marks of office, which often included both the neck ornaments and the headdresses. And as Alan Corbière has written in his article on Anishinaabe headdresses, these were gifts of the community. They weren't, so Caldwell would not have just received that. It certainly wouldn't have been something he could have purchased. That this was in fact a community gift that's bestowed in a council in recognition of their work and recognition of their leadership roles. So in a similar way, where we see in Haudenosaunee societies where women are really active politically, but not necessarily at the center stage of the councils. In Anishinaabe societies, a similar process seems to be occurring. And there are allusions in council minutes, and sometimes you get a glimpse of this when Anishinaabe leaders say in council, as Quineponon did in 1805, when he was pushing back against the British requests for another chunk of the Mississaugas of the Credit Lands. He said, our women have told us we will be poor if we give away any more land. And he's not there speaking about women in general. He's actually referring to the Women's Council that would have met separately and informed the Ogama and Anike Ogama and the Gitche Anishinaabe, or the headmen, their perspective on the potential sale of their lands. Likewise, Quineponon says that our young men tell us we should give away no more. And he's therefore referring to the Warriors' Council. So we get these little clues, these references to women giving advice in council, especially when that advice contradicts what it's almost like the dissenting opinion in a Supreme Court case, where the justices, are articulating a different. You're seeing that dissent, that there's not unanimity. But in Anishinaabeg law, it was the Common Council, the civil chiefs, who had the final decision to make, because those lands were their responsibility. Okay. So I'm just going to come and end us up here. Oh, need to go back one. More. And come back and full circle just as we're ending up. This is actually one of my favorite paintings, and it's in the book. It's a Catlin painting of a canoe race near Sault Ste. Marie in Bawating, 1836 to 1837. And it was actually a piece I entered as evidence when I was serving as an expert witness on a Robertson-Huron Treaty trial. Because it's a few short years before the Robertson-Huron Treaty, and it shows a community gathering and enjoying a race, and there are women in the canoes, there are children in the canoes, there are elders in the canoes, and it brings back together not just the communal life, but the role, and it foregrounds, I think, the role that Anishinaabe women, it makes them visible. The work they had in bringing their worlds together. So I think I'm going to stop there because it's 12:20, and I think Jolene wanted to have some time for questions. Is that Jolene? I think we've lost her. She's frozen.
Yes, that's,
Oh, good.
thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I'm here. I'm sorry. It was on mute, sorry, but yes. Thank you, Heidi. You've laid out some really interesting terrain that unless you're deeply invested in this area is a lot to take in. And so we do have a number of guests with us this afternoon, and we'd like to open up the discussion for questions. You can either post a question in chat, or you can raise your hand and let us know that you have a question. If we could step out of the screen,
PowerPoint?
I'm gonna stop participant sharing just for a moment. Yeah. And so we can return to gallery so I can see if anybody has a question. Okay. Sometimes we need to give students a moment to think through all the information that you shared with us. And so Heidi, I'm just wondering if you could, I mean, just an incredibly rich and complex analysis that you're moving forward. And so can you give us a sense of how this practice is present in Anishinaabe communities today?
Thank you, Jolene. That's a fantastic question. And I would say it's reactivating. The whole reserve system really focused on creating communities that were at the level of the Common Council. So that was a community of anywhere from like 300 to 500 people historically, who had responsibilities over particular lands and territories. And reserves put people on much smaller lands. And then the whole settler colonial period, as I don't have to tell you all, I'm sure, really cut people off from each other. And in Canada, up until the 1951, ceremonies were outlawed, and there was even a pass system in place. It made it very difficult for people to move between reserves. So, but there's been a real interest in activating these reconnections because the stories that those connections once existed are still present. So people know this as their truth, and they're really working hard to reclaim it. And you can see parts of it had already started when, after the ban on ceremonies was lifted, when communities started organizing powwows, and you started to have those regional circuits again. But that really wasn't connected to governance in quite the same way, but it is beginning to now. So there are 6 communities in what's now Ontario who are identified as Mississauga Anishinaabe, the original community up on the north shore of Lake Huron. And they are connected ancestrally and historically with the 5 other Mississauga Anishinaabe communities who are in Southern Ontario today. So New Credit, Hiawatha, Curve Lake, Alderville, and Scugog. And they have, in 2016, they reactivated a new alliance, or they renewed their alliance, I guess, and created a new 21st century alliance accord between the communities to do things collectively, and also to do some really amazing community support work. Like Mississauga First Nation on the North Shore of Lake Huron has still manages a significant tract of land to the north of their community, and they're able to engage in a lot of hunting activities. They routinely take their youth out on the land and things like that. For Credit River, who are living in the southwest corner of the Six Nations Reserve near Hagersville, Ontario, surrounded entirely by farmland, the opportunity to get the youth out on the land in the same way isn't there, right? So now youth are going up to Mississauga. They've reestablished that relationship. But likewise, youth who come down from the North Shore into an urban space to attend post-secondary education, are often finding themselves a little, disconnected from their community. And so, credit is able to provide a different kind of connection. And so it's amazing to see where it's going to go. For the last decade, Credit River has been hosting an annual historical gathering that's brought together these people from these communities and scholars like me who work in the field, and elders who are also knowledge keepers from these different communities, in a historical gathering that lasts 3 days, and a lot of information gets shared and built. So that's a process. When the Robertson Huron Treaty Nations started their trial action against the federal government in 2017, they decided to start it with a gathering at Bawating at the site of the original treaty ceremony. And they've decided to reenact the rekindle those historic regional council fires on an annual basis since. And sadly, this year was virtual because of COVID. But I was able to attend last year's at Wekemkonk, and again, community members came from all the 21 member nations from that alliance. And they were it was very interesting to be talking to people there as I gave a talk there. It was really interesting to be able to talk about a 1642 gathering, that one I just told you about, that had games and it had ceremonies and it had a lot of governance work. And then to be standing there in 2019 where there was a bouncy castles for the kids and a bunch of other games, and there was arts and there was gift exchange and there was governance happening, and the council chiefs were meeting. So and everything was outside. So that process is starting, and it's also starting to use this to reactivate those alliance relationships, to be in nations in that way, so that they can better manage affairs internally and push back against government policy.
Thank you. We have a question from Professor Nadasti.
Hi. Thanks so much for that talk. It was really fascinating. I'm wondering if you could say a few more words about the sort of territoriality and how it relates to the complex governance that you talked about. So I was struck in particular by the way you said that the dotem is always the same in these documents.
Yes.
But you would sort of think that the council fires would have would sort of have authority over territory because they're territorially located, whereas the dotems are not. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about how that works.
This is, again, one of this really fascinating aspects of Anishinaabe governance, I think. It's just, so dotem also ends up being used sort of metaphorically in all kinds of really interesting ways. And actually, there's almost a whole chapter there's a whole chapter in the book called Anishinaabe Constitutionalism, which is about how when those regional gatherings, when they get together, they're not just, I had at least some things out, which I realize now is probably not so good. Those regional gatherings were also places where people made decisions about things like boundaries between common council territories. And so things needed to be shifted because of, so there was a lot of land management decisions that would happen that were of common concern that could happen at those regional councils. And what would happen though, sometimes new council fires needed to be established or kindled. People were moving west. There was fires established at Chiquamacon after the 17th century. There needed to be, when the Credit River moves to their location at the Credit River near just west of Toronto. And when Chippewas of Rama needed, which is where Chippewas of Rama are today between Lake Simcoe and Lake Scugog, the council where that was decided described the kindling of the new fires as a caribou being placed at this location, a bald-headed eagle on a tall pine tree, and there was a double reference for that for the Mississaugas, placed at the mouth of the Credit River. So the dotem was actually used metaphorically to constitute government. And you find this there's stories in William Warren, there are stories in Nicholas Perrot, in other French records, Jesuit records, that refer to the way in which people just conceptualized a particular totem being as being responsible for a particular place, and sort of having, precedence. And it's not really precedence, it's really being the being that was responsible, that was the keeper of the fire, is actually how the wording was described. So the one who had that responsibility. But you needed a full council. You needed other totem beings there. You needed beings from representing the different worlds. So these would be brought in. It's also interesting, because the other thing I found references to is that the councils weren't just responsible for the lands, but they really needed to be in the lands where the totem being's habitat was. So you wouldn't have placed a caribou as the keeper of the council fire at the Credit River, because that wasn't caribou country. The farthest south you could bring the caribou was exactly where they were, which is right at Lake Couchiching, which is right on the edge of the Cambrian Shield. Any farther south, you wouldn't get the woodland caribou. And the Credit River used to be, long before it got polluted, an amazing salmon river. It was full of the same salmon that were in the Mississauga River on Blind River and North Shore Lake Huron. So it really did important metaphorical work in governance.
Any other comment or questions? Thank you, Paul. Professor Geisler?
Thank you. Heidi, I learned so much in this last hour or whatever it was. I can't thank you enough for the lecture.
Thank you.
The things you've gone off on and then brought back together about the Great Lakes and the role of women. And one of the things that struck me as you were helping us through the background history had to do with the difference in the way the British handled land acquisition after the French and Indian War. And you didn't dwell on it, and it really isn't the subject of today's lecture. So perhaps we should carry this on in an email correspondence, but I'm going to put the question anyway. And that is, after, in the 19th century and perhaps even into the 20th, were there instances where the British and subsequently the Canadians ever take the liberty of gifting or granting or taking Anishinaabe lands and using it to capitalize public institutions or things in what we call Canada and ignore the treaties? And where I'm going with this is you differentiated, you said the Americans didn't do that. And we have these dramatic steps south of the border where the American government basically proclaimed public domain and felt they could do whatever they wanted with native lands. And that's such a striking contrast. Why that divide? Why did the British behave the way they did? And I'm guessing offer to pay and make good on those payments for land that they took from the Anishinaabe.
Well, it's a really, really fantastic question. I'll try to give a concise answer, but it's a lot of history. The short bit there. I mean, first of all, Americans did give presents. The Americans gave medals. The Treaty of Canandaigua is another example where they're still giving, bolts of cloth. So it's not that they didn't entirely. So that's one. The British, after the American Revolution, were quite determined that the American experiment was going to fail, and were very convinced that this whole problem of the American Revolution was going to go away. So they really invested in two things. One, having a different Indian policy, and two, quote unquote, behaving differently. That doesn't mean, however, that the Canadian government, especially the Canadian government, like we have to distinguish between the British Crown and colonial officials and the settler colonial government that really begins to mature a lot of whom were Americans, 3/5 of which, you know, by the War of 1812 were actually, you know, has come up from the States. We call them late loyalists. So, you know, so there was a different political culture, essentially. And so Indigenous peoples felt their relationships were with the Crown and were representatives of the Crown. And they got really upset when the British Crown started pulling back out of and retreating from its obligations to them as represented through the relationships with colonial officials here, like governors general. We still have governors general now. And handing on responsibility for maintaining Indian relations, which was about in the middle of the 19th century, to the settler colonial governments. Indigenous peoples protested that vigorously, right, as a betrayal. And the settler colonial governments did live up to their concerns of Indigenous peoples. They, you know, with various acts began clawing at land. Payments get less. Indigenous peoples are basically funding their own residential schools out of their annuity payments. They're funding their own colonization. This starts to happen. And then with the amendment, the Oliver Amendment in 1911 to the Indian Act, municipalities who had a population of greater than 8,000 were permitted to expropriate reserve land that was abutting their municipal boundaries. And so this is why you get giant chemical factories in Amjunong Reserve, Amjunong First Nation in Sarnia today, and where they have 2 girls born for every boy, and that's not normal because that was permitted to happen under the Oliver Act. So it did happen. What's changed in Canada somewhat, and he's given communities a legal place to fight. It was illegal for First Nations to hire lawyers to intervene between 1928 and 1951. But what happened was a combination of things, but most significantly, and there was a lot of growing activism, but most significantly when the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was created in 1982. See, we came a little younger to the Constitution game, I guess. Canada slipped in, and it came in because of the work of Indigenous activists in Canada. But the Constitution now recognizes in Section 25 the Proclamation of 1763, and it recognizes treaties in the Canadian Constitution. And since then, there's been a lot of Supreme Court cases and various jurisprudence that has sort of begun to both carve out and push back against what those means. But it has created a place for people to stick their foot in the door and say, we're going to get some land back, or we're going to reassert some of these treaty rights. These treaty rights are now recognized constitutionally. So that's the short answer. Sorry.
Thank you.
Maybe we could hear from some students if we had a, Kimberly, did you have something? No, okay.
No, I'm just here to learn. It's been great. Thank you.
I think I mistook your motion. The chip bag. All right.
Well,
so Heidi,
you know,
I'm wondering, yeah, Heidi, I'm wondering if you could just maybe go back a little on the symbol of the totem.
Yes.
And just help me understand better what your findings have been. Like how robust is the documentation of what does the physical object look like in the archive? How present are these documents in communities today? You know, if you could just maybe elaborate on that piece of it, I would be really grateful.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, well, first of all, nearly all Anishinaabe treaties, literally with the exception of the Robertson Huron and Robertson Superior Treaty. So all the other land sale agreements with Anishinaabe peoples between the British Crown and British people and Anishinaabe from 1781 to 1862 are in Library and Archives Canada. Has the holdings for the most of them. A few of them are in other manuscript originals are in a few other places. They're not actually in communities, interestingly enough. The Crown said, or at least not that I've found reference to yet, and my experience in the community work I've done to date is that when I show pictures of what the manuscripts look like, most people haven't seen them. Most Canadians haven't seen them. The Library and Archives is behind the Library of Congress, but it has begun digitizing the treaties. So they're now, you can see at least the digitized microfilm online. And for some, when pictures are ordered, you know, for publication, they're now posting those. Others are, I mean, they're all over the place. The Burton Historical Collection at the Detroit Library has, I think, over 300 private land deeds dating from the middle of the 18th century with mostly French settlers who were trying to ensure they could get recognition for their land from their Anishinaabeg neighbors. There are others in, you know, private libraries. They were very popular as curiosities. So quite often, like that 1784 treaty I just showed you, there's a clerk's copy of it, but there's not the original. And in the Francis Bondhead, who was a lieutenant governor of Upper Canada in 1836, he actually took the originals of the documents back with him in his private papers. And the only reason we know this is they came up 2 years ago at auction at Bonham's. So sometimes they get bought up by private collectors too. The former Indian Department Superintendent Duncan Campbell Scott liked to keep them, you know, pictographic curiosities. So they're all over the place. But the main collection I've worked with, by far the largest set, is in Library and Archives Canada.
So I'll just keep having a conversation unless I get an indication that we've got some other questions here. So give me a scope. How many treaties are we talking about?
Oh, see, somebody asked me that. I said, how many treaties? So the Ontario government says, oh, there are 42 treaties that they recognize. And then you're like, okay, well, what constitutes a treaty? Because oftentimes there's correspondence that goes back and forth. There are also dotem images on like petitions. So do you count as part of the treaty the document from the Chiefs and Council protesting the fact that the annuity payments have not been sufficient? Because you'll see those will show up in the records of the Indian Department as well. It's quite a large archive, and it's also one where you start to see the ways in which Christianity and conversion to Christianity started to affect self-representation. So some of them you will see, sometimes people choose not to. And so you'll see documents, especially getting towards the middle of the 19th century, documents that are a mix of people writing their names in English in cursive or printing their names and not using their dotem. In some of those cases, some of the later treaties I've seen where it's just been the Ogama and Anike Ogama who sign with dotem and then it's X marks below or signature below. So yeah, I think there's a large archive, yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. Emily, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much for this talk. It was really, really interesting. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that treaty that you opened with.
Yes, I
did have the 3 women's signatures and maybe some additional information, just why that one, do you know why that one does have the women's signatures? Is it a different context, a different kind of type of treaty, or?
Okay, so thank you, Emily, for that excellent question, because I was realizing, Jolene, if I was going to say, you know what, I actually forgot to tell you this really interesting, most interesting part of this story, which got me into this topic in the first place as I went down on just talking about the book. So I don't yet know why these 3 women appear on this. Am I sharing yet? No, I'm not. Hang on here. Okay, let me.
Do you still have the ability to share?
I do. So I'm going to do this.
Okay, great.
Okay. Now, there are changing gender norms too, right? So in the late 18th century and into the beginning of the 19th century, British women could manage their own property, and there were independent women business owners, and there were widows and single women who had their control over their own estates. And I think the British had a easier time in the 1880s through to the 1780s through to the War of 1812, conceptualizing women as having as signing a document having to do with property. And I think that by the or after the War of 1812, certainly, and by 1830, when laws were passed in both in Britain and in the colonies, eliminating women's right to vote even if they held property, and restricting women's ability to hold property, or not have it, need to have it managed by a male guardian, also contributes to this kind of erasure of women from documents having to do with property. So I think that's a clue. And it's hard to know yet because we haven't found like the smoking gun where the colonial official or missionary says we need to exclude women from these documents. But this document also is a really, really important clue. I'm just going to get to the one section that I wanted to share with you. So of these three women, so the top two are Crane, and I'm not sure about the bottom one. The significance here, and this is also a clerk's copy, like the manuscript original has been lost, and unfortunately clerks have a problem drawing images. I've got an eagle that looks like a duck on one document. You've got multi-headed. Clerks did a fine job reproducing text, and they did a terrible job generally reproducing dotem images. Nevertheless, the clerk manages to capture the tail bustles here, and this is clearly a crane here. So this middle woman, Wapamanes Chokways, she was the widow of Wabakamakat, and Wabakamakat was the former Ogma of Credit River, and he was a key figure, well known to William Johnson, and he was very important in bringing some of the Western Anishinaabe nations into the Covenant Chain Alliance of the Treaty of Niagara. So Alan Corbière has written about him in his thesis. So she's his widow at this point because Wabakamakat died in 1768. Her daughter was baptized by Peter Jones in the late 1820s, and in the baptismal record, she describes being born about Lake Huron in 1746. And this means likely that her mother was from one of the two key Crane Dotem council fires that were, so there was one at Detroit and one at Saginaw Bay. And Wasson, who was one of the key signatories of the Western Anishinaabe, was from sort of the Western Lake Huron council fires, was Crane Dotem himself. So I'm going out on a little bit of a limb here, but we know, for example, that Anishinaabe men always married to somebody from another community. Wabakamakat was from a really important lineage, and he had a really important responsibility, and he had a strong personal relationship with William Johnson. And he was already had a strong relationship with the Haudenosaunee, this whole community at that time. Wasson was from a really prominent community around the Detroit River, and it makes sense. It's a logical sense for there to be a Dotem connection there, because Wabakamakat goes and stays with them in 1761. He goes back and stays again in 1763, and is part of the negotiations to bring these communities in over these 2 years of back and forth. And we know people stayed with their Dotem kin, and that men, and we see this in the archival record all the way back to the 17th century, stayed with their wives' kin as much as their own, and they could call on their wives' kin as much as their own as allies, and they could use that sort of lateral alliance, right? The call on those kin connections. So that's where I think this woman is, you know, and I don't have, I've got these tantalizing bits of evidence, but that really makes sense that she would be a critical broker. And not only that, she would have been accompanying and going with Wabakamakat to Fort Niagara all the time as, because the women they traveled together in families. She would have firsthand knowledge of Johnson's behavior, you know, what the British councils were. She would have attended those councils, and she would have spoken up about this alliance to her own community, her own Crane community back in Detroit, to her family. So she's the key broker, right? She's the key figure here.
Fantastic, Heidi. Thank you. So we'd like to thank our guests that joined us this afternoon. And if you have to break away, that's we completely understand. I'd also like to recognize the students who have joined, Heidi's students who have joined us from the University of Toronto. We have one more question from one of our graduate students, Caitlin, and then we've got a really fascinating question from Jackie Briggs that we'll take up in a moment. Okay, so Caitlin and then Jackie.
Hi, so I'm still taking all of this in. This is so interesting. What really struck me at the beginning of your talk and how you answered the last question was like the merchant records. And that struck me because in a class that I took with Professor Jordan, who was here earlier, we read a merchant record from Albany, and it was Everett Wendell's account book. And I guess the question that I have is related to this. So you mentioned how the merchants would write that the women are accompanied by a man.
Yeah.
And that was very similar to this account book. But what was really, really interesting was that locations and relationships would change. Like the same person would be written, their affiliation would be Seneca. And then it would, like later, a year later, it would be, oh, residing in Mohawk territory. And I think you touched on that a little bit, but I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more if that was apparent to you as you're looking at this as well, like how
location
and how that was reflected in some of these merchant records.
Yeah, so I think I was giving that sort of as a general example in terms of their, you know, relative invisibility. Most of the records I've worked with have been actually the Treaty Council records. As you're pointing to the work of like scholars like Sylvia Van Kirk, who was primarily working with the Hudson's Bay Company records. But I think it was the question you were asking about when women moved location.
I guess, yeah, women or just in general, because it seems like this is very based on alliances, and I was wondering if that was also reflected in the merchant records.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I wouldn't, because I didn't like approach them with that question, so I wouldn't feel comfortable. That's a great question. I will noodle away on that one. The things I can tell you about is that a typical pattern, and I want to say, like, I say these are typical patterns, but that one of the things I've learned from all these studies of Anishinaabeg society, and I have to say, I still consider myself learning lots all the time. I'm learning so much all the time. Is that you know, they weren't dogmatic, so and rigid. So there's lots of flexibilities as situations warrant. So I'm going to say some general principles that tend to, but people weren't futzed. I don't get the sense of people being overly, you know, if something didn't work out the way it was, it was written in a particular way, that there was any sort of real rigidity. That's a real thing you see in terms of the dynamism and creativity in these societies. So when women married, when Wapanamesa Koche married Wabakamakot, he actually would have typically, we would have expected him to have spent a couple years with his wife's family until the birth of, at least the birth of the first child. So then again, he would have forged relationships, he would have hunted with those men, he would have lived with that family, and before she would have moved back. And what's also clear is that when those regional councils were happening, that the women, I mean, so this is the thing about the transparency and governance, right? Because when everybody came, women, children, elders, everybody was there hearing what was being said at these councils. When the regional councils were ratifying local chiefs for common councils, the women who've married out would also be then able to have a voice in the leadership of their birth communities, right? If you think about, and so there was a lot of movement. People would move from community to community, and people are still doing that today. I mean, it's really invigorating when you get to present some of this work in communities. People are like, yeah, it's like, tell us something we know already. But you see that movement, but people still identify themselves, and they still do today. You'll hear people will introduce themselves with their totem and the place that they're from. And those 2 points of reference, totem and community in which you're currently living, were sort of the keys that people used. And there's a wonderful enumeration that the French did in 1736, where they actually did that. They noted the key totem at each community and the name of the community. So,
great. Thank you, Heidi. So we have a question from Jackie. Maybe while I read this, you could take down your screen so that we could bring everybody up in the. Yep. It says, "Hi Heidi, hello Professor Rickard. Thank you for this wonderful talk. Heidi's been such a great role model for me as a settler person researching settler colonialism. I'm wondering if Heidi could talk a bit about her journey as a researcher working in alliance with solidarity with Indigenous peoples and nations. Were there any particular relationships or events or teaching that helped you navigate your role as researcher, as ally?" Great question.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Jackie. That's a great question. Yeah, and I just want to thank my grad students I see who've come today. That's really great. And I hope you get to talk to each other too. Yeah, it's been a really, really amazing journey, actually, and one I think I'm still on. I guess some of the key relationships was just forming an early relationship, very deep friendship early on with Darlene Johnston, who's an Anishinaabe. Well, she's now at UBC, University of British Columbia, but we met by accident at a ethnohistory conference in 2000. There were maybe not by accident. There were 2 seats left at a long table at a conference, and we sat down and we started talking about our work, and we struck up a friendship, and I think the next weekend I drove up to Cape to share my documents with her, and she shared hers with mine and with me, and it started a friendship, and then a lot of teaching, and I learned from her a lot of things about protocol and ethics, and introduced to people. And I think part of my sense early on was just grounded in the belief that as a scholar, I'm trying to find where that came from, but it just something that always made sense, and also was modeled for me by my own supervisor, Sylvia Van Kirk, was that you shared what you found. Like, that's just your obligation as a scholar, right? You share what you find. So I would just go share what I found, and that opened up conversations. And what I didn't realize at the time, but do realize now, is how much of a foundational ethic that is in Indigenous law about reciprocal exchange and about your responsibilities. Like I've learned that through this journey, but I think it was just sort of, that's what you should do. And I also, you know, advice and guidance of people like Darlene, and she then introduced me to Alan Corbière. And early on, I went out to Mississaugas with a credit because I was on the territory, and we just started. But that's a long way of saying it's just, you know, share your work and be a good person. I mean, I'm not an Anishinaabe person. I'm very much grounded, and I was raised Anglican. You know, I was raised in a very particular way. I was raised in a settler family. It's not my culture or my tradition, and it's not one I'm trying to appropriate, but it's one I'm deeply respectful of, and has taught me so much. And so I just have to give that back.
Thank you. So I wanted to share with Heidi a special thank you. But before I do that, I'm wondering if maybe the students from Cornell could introduce themselves, but we'd like to ask actually the students from Toronto to go first and just share with us maybe your name and just, you know, what community you're from or what discipline you're in, just to introduce yourselves to each other, because, you know, Heidi and I are both dedicated to research that crosses the Great Lakes. And, you know, we hope that, you know, you'll have a larger dialogue from this, you know. So where are
our students
from? Do we have some students from Toronto with us?
There's Chandra, I see, and Sheila's up here.
Okay, so let's start with Sheila, because on my screen, all our screens are different. But
Yes.
Sheila, could we start with you today?
Who? Sheila? Me?
Sheila?
Yeah. Oh, hi, I'm Sheila. I'm taking the MA at the University of Toronto. I'm from Moosonee, James Bay, Ontario, and I want to study colonization. And that's basically who I am. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Who else do we have here?
Autumn, Chandra, Zach Roberts.
Okay, Autumn.
Hi, I'm Autumn. I am a Mohawk from Akwesasne. My Mohawk name is Gayogohó, and I'm doing my master's right now at U of T in history. I actually am working with Grassack right now. I'm one of Heidi's work study students, and I'm studying my community of Akwesasne during the Second World War.
Fantastic. And what grade level are you at?
I'm in the first year of my master's.
Okay, fantastic. And then you said Chandra?
Yeah, yep. Hi everyone. I'm Chandra Murdoch. I'm here with my daughter. We really enjoyed the talk. I'm a PhD student of Heidi's here in Toronto. I'm a settler scholar. And I look at the history of the development of the Indian Act, sort of specific to Ontario in the 19th century, and the response of Anishinaabe and to a small degree Haudenosaunee communities as sort of a next iteration of some of the councils that Heidi has been talking about. So there's a group called the Grand General Council of Ontario in the 19th century. So thank you again for organizing. It's been great.
And who's this little one? The newest scholar?
Yeah, this is Lenka. Yeah, she's been trying to wave actually and talk. She's used to FaceTime, so the whole time Heidi was talking, she was trying to talk back. But
well, I feel for you, because when I did my PhD, I also had a baby on my knee. So
thank you.
So Jackie, did you want to share?
Hi, my camera's not working for some reason. Sorry about that. I am in my, oh my gosh, 7th year of my PhD, and Heidi was so kind to join my committee, but I'm based in the Department of Criminology and Legal Studies at the University of Toronto, and I'm looking at the Department of Indian Affairs bureaucracy, and particularly their involvement in the criminal justice system. and this kind of longer term creation of what we now have as like the over incarceration kind of crisis. And my project specifically looks at a legal aid program. So that's me. I do actually have to go because I'm teaching 4 courses this fall, which is not ideal. And I have to go do office hours with this camera that's not working. But I want to thank you all so much for the presentation and for hosting, and to see everyone's wonderful faces on a great Friday afternoon. And I hope everyone can stay healthy, but I have to go.
And it's Karina? Karina.
Karina, yeah.
Karina. Okay.
Hi, I'm Karina. I'm also a master's student at U of T. I'm from South America. I'm from Chile. And I've studied indigenous peoples in South America. And I'm also interested in social movements, specifically indigenous women in North America and South America.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. And then I think you said Zach, right? Zachary?
Hi, I'm Zach. I'm a settler scholar. I'm in my first year of my MA at U of T. And what I'm looking at is specifically the history of Western settlement in Canada, looking at how Indigenous peoples were dispossessed from their land on the merits of race, space, and family, and then how these were continued in Canada through media, looking at specifically landscape paintings and film and theater.
Oh, fantastic. And so was that it in as far as the students, Heidi, for from your group?
I think we're missing just one, so that's great from the group.
Okay, so we'll start with Caitlin from Cornell.
Hi, I'm Caitlin. I'm in my second year of my master's program in archaeology. I study glass beads and beadwork in Seneca context, Onondaga context, and I study trade and I guess visual representations of beadwork. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Caitlin. And we have Samia.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much, Heidi. This was really fascinating to learn about. And I am a current first-year student at Cornell in International Agriculture and Rural Development. And I'm actually calling from occupied Least-John-Ohlone land, which is Bay Area, California.
Yeah.
So it was really fascinating for me to get to learn a little bit more about that area and Anishinaabe peoples, as I'll be moving up there. And I focus a lot on food sovereignty and Indigenous land sovereignty and, yeah, our food and agricultural system. So I appreciate that again. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Peter? Peter, you're muted.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yep. Okay.
I'm Peter. I'm a 4th year in the PhD program in French at Cornell. I'm originally from France myself. My thesis is about processes of racialization and the concept of race within the French nation, and how that ties in with questions of colonization, particularly in the Caribbean, but also settler colonialism and nuclearism in the Pacific.
Thanks, Peter. Emily?
Hi, my name is Emily. I'm a first year in the anthropology department in my PhD program at Cornell, and I'm interested in questions of how conservation law interacts with identity, specifically in Alaska.
Great.
Waylon?
I'm Waylon Wilson from the Tuscarora Nation. I'm Deer Clan. I'm a first-year PhD student here at Cornell in the Performing and Media Arts Department. And I'm currently researching possible intersections between cinema and video games, particularly in documentary filmmaking and interactive documentary making, I guess. So yeah, I want to say Nyawa, Heidi, I've met you before. I really appreciated your talk. I thought it was very interesting, and I was particularly taken by the visuals presented in you, and you know the way they were, I guess, captured over time. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Della?
Oh, thank you. I was worried you'd forget we were two people in one. Buju Benesu Kwenindiga Makunindudem Gawabagana Kagandujaba. I'm Della. I'm White Earth Anishinaabe. I'm a Squawky. I am a junior in environment and sustainability, minoring in American Indian Indigenous Studies.
Great, thank you, Della. And we're also joined this afternoon by our new presidential postdoc, Dr. Meredith Palmer. Meredith, would you like to say hi? Meredith's muted. Okay. Okay, and then we're also joined by our the Associate Director of the American Indian and Indigenous Studies Program, but also a scholar, Dr. Ula Pasia-Mansfield. Ula, did you want to say hello?
Hi, Ula.
It's really good to see you. Really great presentation. Learned a lot. Thank you for all the work you do.
Okay, great. And so, and then of course, we'd like to just thank Ben for all the work that he always does every week to help us make this happen. And so, you know, usually when we have a guest speaker, Heidi, we have a beautiful luncheon, and then we gift you, and you know, we make sure that you have time to spend with students for a luncheon, and then some faculty would join you for dinner. And we're so sorry this year that because of COVID, we're of course practicing other means, but I hope that what this means is that you'll come back and spend time with us in the near future, because I think we have, you know, we don't have someone in history that's, you know, really drilling down the way you are in this area. And it would be so valuable because we have so many students that are interested in Anishinaabe history and culture. And we also, you know, would really benefit from, I think, you know, having more awareness of this because of the relationship between the Haudenosaunee to the Anishinaabe. And we have lots of scholars here focused on that. And so I'd just like to gift you virtually for a little beaded canoe from Tuscarora that will be coming your way once it's safe to send things across the border. And I know that, you know, this is a metaphor, of course. You know, the canoe is a big deal in Canada, but it's just an ongoing metaphor about continuing to build relationships, you know, because as scholars, you know, your entire professional life is built on these kinds of relationships. And I hope that you'll feel that you can reach out to the students at Cornell that you've just met, as well as, you know, with each other, and as well as, you know, Dr. Bohaker, you know, to expand your areas of research, or if you have additional things that you'd like to tap into. And so unless anybody has any other questions today or wants to make a final comment, we'll stop with our, Heidi, yes, thank you.
Well, I just wanted to say, Jolene, that thank you so much to Miigwech for this incredible opportunity, and to say that, you know, as I was speaking, I was also thinking about the insights you've given to Grassack over the years about the importance of building bridges across, as you were saying, like this is, you know, something you've really pointed out, that we've done these sort of silos in a way in Anishinaabe studies, in Iroquois or Haudenosaunee studies, where you're developing depth. And your professor, you know, has always been really articulate about the need for these kinds of studies to go across and to really be bringing these scholars together. And I think, you know, that's the spirit in which GrassX is formed. And if you are interested, by the way, it's open to anyone. So I can put the website up already, and you can get a membership. Our students, you get on the listserv, get the newsletter that comes out. It's got, I think last month's had featured Professor Jordan's work in it. Autumn is writing a piece on a chatelaine bag that's going to appear in this coming up episode, so you'll recognize somebody's work. So we do a monthly newsletter as well, and we really try to connect scholars and community-based researchers so that we can build these connections. You know, in this work, none of us, like, that's the one thing I've really learned, is that, you know, no single person is going to do this work and become the expert, right? It's not about that. It's about sharing knowledge with each other, building the connections, and we'll see new patterns. You know, Jolene, in that brief speech I mentioned about Quinnipiac referring to the women in 1806, or 1805, sorry, at that exact council, there's a little line at the bottom where he says, and give this belt back to the Tuscaroras, to the British colonial official, William Clouse. And I've said, we got to follow up on that, because there's some belt, treaty arrangement between the Mississaugas and the Tuscarora that we haven't even, you know, explored the extent of, right? There are so many stories that are waiting to be brought into the present.
I mean, it really is a dynamic tension for those of us involved in the contemporary side of it, because I think there's so much recovery right now of this historical material and rethinking of how we think at historical material. And I think, Heidi, that it's not lost on anyone in this group that you're, in a sense, working in a new methodological way in the field of history. And that not only the text, the book, becomes your site of analysis, but that you've actually activated the material archive as a critical site of knowledge. And so, I mean, it applies to us. I'm thinking about the work that our students are sharing with us. It applies to, like, for instance, you know, the methodology that we could all, I think, benefit from, you know, and in particular, I'm thinking about Caitlin's work on the bead, and you know, there will be, I think, those opportunities. And so I really think your mention to publish in GraceAct, to look at the little vignettes on that site, because the you know, it's, you know, it doesn't have to be like a 30-page essay. You can do just a small PowerPoint and a caption. But it's interesting how those PowerPoints and captions really open up a world of scholars to you who are also thinking about these same points, and you can begin a dialogue and develop your own network of people who are looking carefully at these things. And so that's, I think, what's you know, that's what I guess we're all encouraging, is that it's, you know, that there's so much recovery to do in the area of Indigenous studies, you know, because there is this other position of refusal that we, you know, and so yes, nobody is ever asking, I think, to share ceremonial knowledge or to be forthcoming in like the knowledge that is really meant for knowledge holders within the communities. But, you know, there's so much work to be done on the outside historical what would you say, sites of contact, so that it's really an important project, you know, because we have to develop new models. I mean, because we're being you know, with the resurgence of Indigenous peoples, we have to really rethink what our relationships are to a peoples who are, you know, we're asserting nationhood, and we are, you know, asking to be recognized as, you know, next, you know, as as autochthonous spaces. And so knowing these histories, the mutual histories, is so important. And so, you know, you've helped us a great deal today, Heidi.
Thanks, Jolene. I sometimes, yeah, I sometimes get lost in the details, but the details are where the stories are. But I think, you know, I'm really excited that the book's coming out with the Osgood Society too. And the reason for that is that it has 1,000 members who are judges and lawyers. So they're all going to get a copy of the book if they're members, whether they want it or not. And I'm hoping they want it. It has 32 pages of color, so they'll hopefully look at the pictures. But it's important because, I mean, and this is with Grass Act too, is that we've taken this position that we're supporting sovereignties, that we're supporting this work. And so, and what I think, you know, the work also shows, and again, it's not focused on, you know, mining ceremonial knowledge or that kind of private knowledge, but it shows with this analysis that the British as well were engaged, that those treaties were actually entered into within the context of Anishinaabe law. And I suspect very much true when you look at Haudenosaunee treaties with the British Crown too. They too were entered into in the spirit of Haudenosaunee law. That is, the British were performing Haudenosaunee law, they were performing Anishinaabe law. And so, you know, the legal implications there for recognizing sovereignty are really huge because it shows you that they were recognizing it in that earlier period. And they stop recognizing it. You can point to when they stop recognizing it, or they try to pretend that they never recognized it is the more accurate statement, right? They try to pretend they never recognized it. And so, you know, in order to really, you know, so the, you know, all these different ways of enacting sovereignty and reenacting sovereignty in these settler states, but certainly in the courts, where in Canada that's become a place where communities are reasserting sovereignty and reasserting treaty rights, having a legal system that understands that you know, Turtle Island is a legally plural place, and that the settlers recognize that legal pluralism, and not only that, entered into legal contracts based on the law of the land, not their own common law tradition, is I think really important to getting settlers' minds wrapped around the idea that these obligations aren't just, you know, politically correct as you hear moments of the present, but are anchored in law, and in law, you know, that that still has meaning today. So, and that's, you know, sort of the more contemporary, I guess, implications of looking at Jesuit records from 400 years ago.
Yes, wow. As you are witnessing, we could just keep going.
Yeah,
but,
sorry.
I'd just like to mention that we'll meet again in 2 weeks, and we have a very exciting position on indigeneity in the environment with the work of the recently released an award-winning text called Low Tech, and we'll be hearing from Julia Watson. And so I hope everybody has a good day today, and I'd just like to say Nyawa to Professor Bohaker one more time.
Oh, Nyawa and Jolene.
And to remind her that she does have a canoe coming, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Okay, so thanks again, Heidi. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.